Is that... Daniel, I can explain.
200 guests had gathered inside the Rosewood Grand Ballroom to watch Daniel Carter marry the woman he had loved for nearly 3 years. The bride stood beneath an arch of white roses. The string quartet had just fallen silent, and Daniel was standing at the altar in a perfectly tailored white tuxedo when a man stepped out from the crowd, holding an open can of thick black paint. Nobody understood what he was doing until he reached Daniel. Then, without warning, he lifted the can and poured the entire contents across the groom's chest. Black paint ran down Daniel's white jacket, over his hands, across his trousers, and onto the polished floor. The ballroom went completely silent. 200 people stared at him. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. And then Daniel slowly raised his eyes toward his bride, Emily Lawson. What happened next was even more disturbing than the paint. Emily did not rush toward him. She did not scream at the man who had humiliated her fiancé in front of their families and friends. She did not ask Daniel if he was hurt. Instead, she stood completely still, staring at him with an expression that was almost impossible to read. Daniel looked at her for several seconds. Then he reached up, wiped a line of black paint from his cheek, and looked at the wedding ring on his finger. His voice was quiet enough that the first few rows almost missed it. "So you knew about this?" Emily's lips parted, but no answer came. Daniel looked around the room. His mother was crying. His best man, Marcus Reed, looked ready to attack someone. Emily's father had gone pale. The man holding the empty paint can was already backing away. Then Daniel looked directly at Emily again and said 6 words that ended the wedding. "I can't marry you. We're done." Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Those 6 words were not shouted. Daniel didn't throw his ring. He didn't insult Emily. He simply removed the ring from his finger, placed it carefully on the altar beside the flowers, and stepped away. For several seconds, the entire ballroom remained frozen. Then Emily finally moved. She rushed toward him, but Daniel raised one hand. "Don't," he said, and that single word made her stop. The wedding coordinator stood near the entrance with tears in her eyes, while guests began whispering among themselves. Nobody understood what had just happened. Some believed Daniel had been embarrassed beyond repair. Others assumed Emily had somehow been involved. But the truth was more complicated. Daniel had not ended his wedding because a stranger poured paint on him. He ended it because, in that moment, he realized something he had been trying desperately not to believe. The paint had not been an attack. It had been a warning. Daniel walked away from the altar while black paint continued dripping from his sleeves. Marcus followed immediately, pushing through the stunned guests until he caught up with him near the ballroom doors. "Daniel, wait." Daniel kept walking. "Not here." Marcus grabbed his shoulder gently. "You need to tell me what's happening." Daniel finally turned. His face looked strangely calm. "I already know." Marcus stared at him. "Know what?" Daniel glanced toward the ballroom. Through the open doors, he could see Emily standing beside the altar, surrounded by people who had once been celebrating her. "Everything I needed to know." Marcus shook his head. "That doesn't explain anything." Daniel looked down at his ruined tuxedo. "The paint does." Marcus looked confused. "The paint?" Daniel nodded. "It wasn't supposed to happen today." That sentence changed everything. Marcus lowered his voice. "You knew someone might do this?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small envelope that had somehow remained dry beneath the fabric. He handed it to Marcus. "I received this yesterday." Marcus opened it. Inside were 3 photographs and a handwritten note. The first photograph showed Emily standing outside a downtown hotel with another man. The second showed Emily entering a private office building late at night. The third showed Daniel himself standing outside that same building 2 weeks earlier. Marcus looked up. What is this? Daniel took the photographs back. The reason I didn't cancel the wedding yesterday. Marcus frowned. You knew she was hiding something? Daniel nodded. I knew she was hiding something. I didn't know what. He looked toward the ballroom again. But tonight, someone made sure I found out. Marcus studied him carefully. Who sent this? Daniel shook his head. No name. And you still came to the wedding? Yes. Marcus couldn't believe it. Why? Daniel's answer was quiet. Because I wanted to give her one last chance to tell me the truth herself. Inside the ballroom, Emily had begun crying. Her mother was trying to calm her while guests whispered in small groups. Some were already recording the scene on their phones. The man who had poured the paint had disappeared. Daniel's father stood near the entrance, speaking angrily into his phone. Nobody noticed Emily's younger sister, Rachel, watching Daniel from across the room with an expression of pure fear. Daniel did. Their eyes met. Rachel immediately looked away. That was when Daniel knew there was another person who understood what was happening. He walked back toward the ballroom, but not toward Emily. He walked toward Rachel. You knew too, he said. Rachel's eyes filled with tears. Daniel, please. How long? She didn't answer. Rachel, how long? She looked toward her sister, then lowered her voice. Since before you proposed. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. That answer hurt more than the paint. For nearly 3 years, Daniel had believed his relationship with Emily was built on honesty. They had met at a charity fundraiser, become friends first, and eventually fallen in love. Their engagement had been celebrated by both families. Daniel had never doubted Emily's loyalty because she had always given him reasons to trust her. Or at least, that was what he had believed. The photographs had changed everything. Yet even after seeing them, Daniel had not confronted her. He wanted to hear the truth from her mouth. He wanted to know whether the woman standing beside him at the altar was the same woman he had loved or someone he had only imagined. The paint had answered one question. Emily knew something was coming. Her reaction had proven it. Daniel approached her slowly. The room quieted again as people realized he was returning. Emily wiped her face. Daniel, please let me explain. You can explain, he said. But don't lie to me. She swallowed hard. I never wanted this to happen. What didn't you want? She looked at the floor. The paint. Daniel nodded. Who did? Emily didn't answer. Her father stepped forward. Daniel, this has gone far enough. Daniel looked at him. Mr. Lawson, with respect, you should let your daughter speak. Emily's father hesitated. She's upset. So am I. Daniel's voice remained calm. But I'm still standing here. Emily finally whispered. The man with the paint was supposed to frighten you. A gasp moved through the crowd. Marcus stepped forward. What? Daniel looked at Emily. Why? She began crying again. I didn't know he would actually do it. Daniel stared at her. You hired someone to frighten your groom at your wedding? Emily shook her head. No, I didn't hire him. Then who did? Before Emily could answer, her father interrupted. This is a family matter. Daniel turned toward him. No, it stopped being a family matter when someone poured paint on me in front of 200 people. The room fell silent. Emily's father looked furious. You have no idea what you're accusing us of. Daniel smiled sadly. That's exactly the problem. I don't know what you've been hiding. Emily suddenly grabbed Daniel's arm. Please, not here. He gently removed her hand. You had 3 years to tell me. You had the entire ceremony to tell me. You had every opportunity before the paint came down. Emily whispered. I was afraid. Of me. Of what would happen if you knew the truth. Daniel's expression changed. Then tell me. Emily looked toward her father. He shook his head almost imperceptibly. Daniel noticed. So did Marcus. Rachel began crying quietly. Finally, Emily said, the man in those photographs is Adrian Cole. Daniel knew the name. Everyone in the room did. Adrian was a wealthy developer who had once partnered with Emily's father. Their business relationship had ended badly after a major property deal collapsed. Daniel looked at Emily. Why were you meeting him? She hesitated. Because he had something that belonged to my father. Daniel frowned. What? Emily whispered. Evidence. Daniel's heart sank. Evidence of what? Emily looked at her father. He closed his eyes. Then she said, fraud. The word moved through the ballroom like a shockwave. Several guests exchanged frightened looks. Emily's father immediately stepped toward her. Enough. But Daniel did not move. What kind of fraud? Emily looked terrified. Financial fraud. Daniel stared at her father. Is that why Adrian was involved? No answer. And is that why someone wanted me frightened tonight? Still nothing. Then Rachel stepped forward. Because Daniel was going to discover it. Her father turned on her. Rachel. She flinched, but continued. He was already asking questions. Daniel looked at her. What questions? Rachel wiped her tears. About the company. About the money that disappeared from several accounts. About the investment you made last year. Daniel's face hardened. He suddenly remembered something Emily had said months earlier. She had asked him to invest in her father's company. Daniel had trusted her and transferred a significant amount of money. At the time, she had told him it was a temporary bridge loan. He had never questioned it because he trusted her. Now he understood why the photographs included the office building. How much? Daniel asked. Emily looked away. How much of my money is gone? Her silence was enough. Daniel turned toward her father. How much? The older man finally said, your investment was never lost. Daniel waited. It was moved. Where? Into another account. Whose account? Nobody answered. Daniel took a slow breath. Emily. She began shaking her head. I didn't take it. Daniel looked directly at her. Then who did? Her father stepped forward again. Daniel, you need to understand that we were under pressure. You used my money. It wasn't theft. Daniel laughed once, without humor. What would you call it? Then the ballroom doors opened. A man in a dark suit entered with two women carrying folders. Several guests recognized him immediately. He was Thomas Grant, a federal financial investigator who had been quietly investigating Lawson Development for months. Daniel stared at him. Emily's father went completely pale. Thomas looked around the ballroom and said, I'm sorry to interrupt. Nobody spoke. He walked toward Daniel. Mr. Carter, I need to ask you a few questions. Daniel nodded. About my investment? Thomas looked surprised. You know? Daniel looked toward Emily. I'm beginning to. Thomas opened one of the folders. Your investment wasn't the only one affected. He looked toward Emily's father. There are 12 other investors. Victor Lawson's face hardened. You don't have authority to do this here. Thomas replied, Actually, I do. Daniel suddenly realized the wedding had never been the center of the story. It had been a distraction. The elaborate flowers, the expensive venue, the 200 guests, the cameras, the champagne, the speeches, all of it had created the perfect environment for one final act. Somebody had wanted Daniel humiliated before he could ask questions. But the biggest question remained unanswered. Who had ordered the paint? Thomas pulled Daniel aside and lowered his voice. The man who poured the paint is named Stephen Hale. Daniel looked at him. Where is he? Gone. Did you arrest him? Not yet. Daniel's eyes narrowed. Why? Thomas handed him a photograph. It showed Stephen entering a parking garage earlier that afternoon. Because he disappeared before our team arrived. Daniel studied the image. Who paid him? Thomas looked toward Emily. That's what we're trying to determine. Emily suddenly spoke. I know. Everyone turned. She was trembling. It was my father. Victor Lawson's expression changed. Emily. I'm sorry. She looked at Daniel. He told Stephen to frighten you. Victor stepped toward her. You have no idea what you're saying. Emily backed away. I heard you. Daniel stared at her. Why would your father want to frighten me? Emily looked at the floor. Because he knew you were going to leave me. Daniel felt his chest tighten. What? Emily cried. You were getting suspicious. You were asking questions. You were talking to accountants. You were going to discover the money. Daniel slowly shook his head. So your father wanted me to think you were innocent? He wanted you to feel humiliated enough to leave without investigating. Thomas looked at Victor. Is that correct? Victor said nothing. That silence was almost an admission. Daniel looked at Emily. And you? She closed her eyes. I knew he was planning something. When? Yesterday. And you said nothing. I was afraid. Daniel's voice softened, but his words were devastating. You were afraid of losing me, so you let someone humiliate me at our wedding. Emily broke down completely. The guests were no longer whispering. They were listening. Some had begun crying. Others looked disgusted. Daniel looked around the room at the people who had come to celebrate his marriage. Now they were witnessing the collapse of an entire family. He removed the paint-stained jacket and handed it to Marcus. I need air. Marcus followed him outside. On the terrace, the city lights stretched beneath them. Daniel stood silently for nearly a minute. Marcus finally said, "Are you okay?" Daniel shook his head. No. It was the first honest answer he had given all night. I loved her. Marcus nodded. I know. I still do. That doesn't mean you have to marry her. Daniel looked at his bare finger. I know. Then his phone rang. It was an unknown number. He answered. Daniel Carter? Yes. A man's voice said, if you want the truth about Emily, meet me alone. Daniel looked at Marcus. Who is this? The caller said, the person who warned you before the paint. Then the line went dead. Daniel stared at the phone. Marcus asked, what did he say? Daniel didn't answer. He was looking back through the glass doors at Emily. She was standing alone beside the altar, crying. Then Daniel noticed something strange. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the empty chair where Adrian Cole had been sitting earlier that evening. Adrian was gone. Daniel didn't go to the meeting alone. He understood the warning immediately. Whoever had called knew more than he did, and that made the person dangerous. Marcus insisted on coming, but Daniel asked him to stay outside the building. The meeting took place in a small coffee shop nearly 20 minutes from the hotel. Daniel arrived first. 10 minutes later, Adrian Cole walked through the door. Daniel recognized him immediately from the photographs. Adrian sat across from him. You shouldn't have come. Daniel replied, you called me. Adrian nodded. I wanted to warn you. About Emily? Adrian looked down. About her family. Daniel waited. Adrian pulled a flash drive from his pocket and placed it on the table. Everything you need is on this. Daniel didn't touch it. Why help me? Adrian looked tired. Because I made the same mistake you did. I trusted Victor Lawson. Adrian explained that he had once invested millions into Lawson Development. When he discovered that company funds were being transferred into private accounts, he confronted Victor. Instead of admitting what he had done, Victor blamed Adrian for the missing money. Adrian lost his company, his reputation, and almost everything he had built. Emily knew, he said. Daniel looked at him. She knew about the fraud? Not at first. Adrian continued. She discovered it later. She tried to convince her father to return the money. Daniel frowned. Then why did she stay? Adrian's answer was painful. Because Victor threatened her. Daniel stared at him. With what? He had evidence that could destroy her. Daniel felt the pieces shifting again. Adrian opened his phone and showed Daniel several messages. They were from Emily. Months earlier, she had begged Adrian for help. She had written that her father had threatened to expose a secret from her past if she reported him. Daniel looked at the messages carefully. What secret? Adrian hesitated. That's something Emily needs to tell you herself. Daniel stood. Then why didn't she? Adrian looked directly at him. Because she was ashamed. Daniel walked toward the door, but Adrian stopped him. Daniel. He turned. The paint wasn't just meant to humiliate you. Daniel waited. It was meant to make you leave the wedding before the investigators arrived. Daniel froze. Why? Adrian replied. Because Thomas Grant wasn't supposed to be there tonight. Someone leaked the investigation to Victor. Your wedding was supposed to become a distraction. Daniel returned to the hotel with the flash drive. By then, most guests had left. The ballroom looked nothing like it had earlier. Flowers were scattered across the floor. Half-empty glasses remained on tables. The wedding cake stood untouched. Daniel walked toward Emily. We need to talk. She nodded. I know. They sat in 2 chairs facing each other. Daniel placed the flash drive between them. Adrian gave me this. Emily immediately began crying. Then you know. I know your father committed fraud. I know you knew. I know you were afraid. But I don't know your secret. Emily looked at him for a long time. Then she whispered, I caused the accident. Daniel stared at her. What accident? Emily's hands trembled. 3 years ago, before I met you, my younger brother died in a car accident. Daniel remembered Emily mentioning her brother only once. She had never spoken about the details. What does that have to do with your father? Emily took a deep breath. He was driving the company vehicle. He had been drinking. I knew he shouldn't drive, but I gave him the keys because I was angry with him. Daniel's expression softened. Emily. She shook her head. I didn't know he would crash. I didn't know. Daniel reached across the table, but stopped himself. Why would your father use that against you? Because he knew I blamed myself. She began crying. He told me if I ever exposed him, he would make sure everyone knew I had caused my brother's death. Daniel was silent. Emily continued. Then I met you. You made me believe I could have a normal life. Daniel looked at her. And you never told me. I wanted to. So many times. But you didn't. Emily wiped her tears. When you started investigating the company, my father told me he would destroy you. He said he would tell you everything about my brother. I was terrified. Daniel looked down. So you chose silence. I chose fear. He shook his head. They're not always different. Emily looked at him. I know. Daniel stood and walked toward the window. The ballroom was almost empty now. You should have trusted me. I know. You should have let me decide whether your past changed how I felt about you. Emily whispered. I was afraid you would leave. Daniel turned around. And now? She looked at the ring sitting on the altar. Now I've lost you anyway. For the first time that night, Daniel's anger disappeared. What remained was grief. He understood that Emily had been manipulated, but understanding did not erase what she had done. She had allowed a man to humiliate him. She had kept financial information from him. She had allowed their wedding to become a trap. Love could explain those choices, but it could not excuse them. Daniel picked up the ring. I believe you about your brother. Emily looked hopeful for a second. But I can't marry you. She nodded through tears. I understand. I hope one day you forgive yourself. Do you forgive me? Daniel hesitated. I'm trying. He placed the ring back on the table. Then the ballroom doors opened again. Thomas Grant entered with 2 officers. Daniel, we need you to come with us. Daniel looked surprised. Why? Thomas looked at Emily. Because we've just received new evidence. Emily stood. What evidence? Thomas replied. A recording. Victor Lawson's voice came from a device in Thomas's hand. Make sure Carter leaves before the investigators arrive. If he doesn't, use the paint. I don't care how. Emily covered her mouth. Daniel closed his eyes. The recording confirmed what they had suspected. But then another voice appeared on the recording. A woman's voice. A voice Daniel recognized immediately. Emily's. Daniel looked at Emily as if he no longer recognized her. That's you. Emily shook her head rapidly. I didn't say that. Thomas replayed the recording. The voice was unmistakably Emily's. He can't find out yet. Give me until after the ceremony. Daniel felt the last piece of trust disappear. What did you mean by that? Emily looked terrified. I don't remember saying it. Thomas stared at her. The recording was made 3 days ago. Emily shook her head. Someone edited it. Thomas replied. The forensic team confirmed the recording is authentic. Daniel stepped back. What else don't I know? Emily suddenly remembered something. My father had access to my phone. Thomas looked at her. When? He took it last week. He said he needed to check something. Daniel asked. Could he have used your voice? Emily nodded slowly. He knew how to make calls from my phone. Thomas looked at Daniel. That changes things. Daniel turned toward Emily. Why didn't you tell me that? Because I didn't know. The room became silent again. Then Thomas received a message. He read it and looked up. We found Stephen Hale. Daniel asked, where? At the airport. Did he talk? Thomas shook his head. Not yet. Then he added, but he had something with him. A small envelope was placed on the table. Inside was a photograph. It showed Emily standing beside Victor and Stephen outside the hotel the previous evening. Daniel looked at the photograph. So she was involved. Emily stared at it. I don't remember this. Thomas examined the image. The timestamp says 11:47 p.m. Emily looked confused. I was at home at 11:47. Daniel looked at her. Can anyone confirm that? Emily's face went pale. My sister. Thomas immediately called Rachel. When she arrived, she confirmed Emily had been home. She never left. Thomas studied the photograph again. Then somebody staged this. Daniel asked, why? Thomas looked at him. To make sure everyone believed Emily was part of it. Suddenly, Daniel understood. The entire night had been designed to create a story. The paint would make him look humiliated. Emily's silence would make her look guilty. The photographs would make her appear involved. The recording would make her sound complicit. And the financial scandal would destroy the family. Someone had planned every piece carefully. But why? Thomas gave him the answer. Victor Lawson wasn't the person controlling everything. Daniel looked at him. Who was? Thomas hesitated. We're still investigating. Then the phone rang. It was Rachel. Her voice was shaking. Daniel, I know who it is. Daniel's stomach tightened. Who? Rachel whispered a name Daniel had never expected to hear. Marcus. Daniel stared at the phone. Marcus. Rachel nodded through the call. I saw him talking to Victor yesterday. Daniel looked toward the entrance. Marcus had been his closest friend for more than a decade. He had stood beside Daniel through his career, his engagement, and every difficult moment leading to the wedding. Daniel refused to believe it. Rachel, are you sure? I saw them together. Thomas asked, where? Rachel gave him the location. Daniel immediately called Marcus. No answer. He called again. Nothing. Then Daniel noticed something that made his blood run cold. Marcus had been the person standing beside him when the envelope arrived. Marcus had known about the photographs before anyone else. Marcus had followed him outside after the paint. Marcus had known exactly where Daniel would go. Daniel sat down slowly. I gave him everything. Thomas looked at him. Then he may know everything too. Daniel remembered something else. 2 months earlier, Marcus had asked him about his investment in Lawson Development. At the time, Daniel had thought it was ordinary curiosity. Now it looked different. Thomas asked, do you have any records of your conversations with him? Daniel nodded. Everything. They reviewed the messages. Most appeared harmless. Then they found one from Marcus to an unknown number. He still trusts me. Another message followed 2 days later. The wedding will happen. Daniel's face went blank. Thomas looked at him. I'm sorry. Daniel shook his head. Don't be. He stared at the messages. I need to know why. They found Marcus 2 hours later at an apartment across town. He didn't resist when investigators entered. When Daniel walked inside, Marcus looked at him with tears in his eyes. You found out. Daniel stared at him. How long? Marcus lowered his head. A year. You knew about the fraud? Yes. You knew about Emily? Marcus nodded. You knew about the paint? He hesitated. Yes. Daniel's voice cracked. Why? Marcus finally looked up. Because I owed Victor money. The explanation was devastating. Marcus had invested in one of Victor's failed projects. He had lost almost everything and borrowed money to cover the losses. Victor offered him a way out. In exchange, Marcus had to monitor Daniel, report what he knew about the investment, and make sure Daniel didn't investigate too deeply. And the wedding? Daniel asked. Marcus wiped his face. Victor told me the paint would make you leave. You knew he would humiliate me. I thought it would be a warning. Daniel stared at him. You thought watching your best friend get humiliated in front of 200 people was a warning. Marcus began crying. I was desperate. Daniel looked at the man he had trusted most. You didn't betray me because you hated me. Marcus shook his head. You betrayed me because you valued your fear more than our friendship. Marcus said nothing. Daniel turned toward the door. Then Marcus called after him. Daniel. He stopped. There's one more thing. Daniel looked back. Marcus said, Victor wasn't planning to stop after the wedding. Daniel's expression hardened. What was he planning? Marcus whispered. He was going to make sure you never had a chance to expose him. Thomas immediately demanded details. Marcus explained that Victor had arranged for Daniel to be blamed for financial crimes committed through the investment account. The plan was simple. Money had already been moved into accounts connected to Daniel's identity. Documents had been forged to make it appear that Daniel had authorized the transfers. The wedding was supposed to provide a perfect opportunity to publicly destroy his reputation. The paint incident would make Daniel look unstable. The financial records would appear afterward. Then Victor would tell investigators that Daniel had been threatening the family after discovering the company was in trouble. Daniel listened without speaking. The wedding had not simply been designed to end his marriage. It had been designed to end his freedom. Thomas asked Marcus where the evidence was. Marcus gave him the location of a safe deposit box. Inside were contracts, bank statements, recordings, and copies of instructions signed by Victor. But there was one final document that changed everything. It was a list of names. 12 investors, 2 accountants, 3 lawyers, 1 judge, and beside each name was a payment amount. Daniel looked at the page. This goes much deeper than Victor. Thomas nodded. It does. The investigation expanded overnight. The following week became a national story. News outlets reported that Lawson Development had allegedly concealed millions of dollars in fraudulent transactions. Victor Lawson was arrested. Several executives resigned. Marcus cooperated with investigators and accepted responsibility for his role. Emily testified about her father's threats and the manipulation she had experienced. She also admitted her own mistakes publicly. Daniel did not return to her. He understood that forgiveness and reconciliation were not the same thing. Months later, Daniel stood in the same hotel ballroom where his wedding had collapsed. The hotel had been renovated, but he remembered every detail. The altar was gone. The black paint stain had long since disappeared from the marble. Yet the memory remained. A journalist approached him after a business conference. People call that night the moment everything changed for you. Do you agree? Daniel thought about the question. Yes. Because you discovered the fraud? Daniel shook his head. Because I discovered who people really were. The journalist asked whether he regretted the wedding. Daniel looked toward the ballroom entrance. I regret believing that love means ignoring warning signs. He paused. But I don't regret walking away. The journalist asked about Emily. Daniel answered carefully. She made mistakes. So did I. She deserved compassion, but I also deserved honesty. He didn't speak badly about her. He never did. Instead, he focused on what the experience taught him. Sometimes the hardest decision isn't leaving someone you don't love. It's leaving someone you still love because staying would require you to betray yourself. That sentence eventually became the most quoted part of the interview. But Daniel's story wasn't finished. Several months after the scandal, Thomas contacted him again. We found another account. Daniel asked, whose? Thomas said, Emily's. Daniel immediately became cautious. What does that mean? Thomas replied, it means the investigation isn't over. The account contained nearly $2 million. Daniel was shocked. Emily had always insisted she never took his money. Now there was evidence suggesting otherwise. Thomas sent Daniel the transaction records. The account had been opened in Emily's name 6 months before the wedding. Money had been deposited regularly. Daniel called Emily. She answered immediately. I know why you're calling. Daniel asked, did you know about this account? No. Your name is on it. Emily began crying. I never opened it. Daniel believed she was telling the truth, but belief was no longer enough. He needed evidence. A forensic investigation discovered that Emily's identity had been used without her knowledge. The account had been opened using stolen documents. But the person who created it had made one mistake. They had used a password that had appeared in an old message between Victor and Marcus. The account wasn't Emily's. It belonged to Victor. The money was part of a larger scheme to make Emily appear guilty if the investigation reached her. Daniel finally understood why the family had tried so hard to control the story. Victor needed a scapegoat. Emily was perfect. She was his daughter. She knew enough to be believable, and she loved Daniel enough to remain silent. The final trial lasted months. Victor was convicted on multiple financial charges. Marcus testified against him. Several executives received reduced sentences for cooperating. Emily testified as well. She admitted that she had known about the financial misconduct but had been too afraid to report it. She accepted responsibility for her silence. The court recognized her cooperation, but her reputation had already suffered. She left the city afterward and began working with an organization that helped victims of financial abuse and coercive control. Daniel never saw her for nearly a year. Then one afternoon, he received a letter. It was short. Emily wrote that she didn't expect forgiveness. She only wanted him to know that she finally understood something she hadn't understood on their wedding day. "I thought losing you would be the worst thing that could happen to me," she wrote. "I now realize the worst thing would have been becoming the person my father wanted me to become." Daniel read the letter twice. He didn't respond immediately. Weeks passed. Eventually, he wrote back. He told her he hoped she found peace. He told her he had forgiven her, but he wasn't ready to rebuild the relationship they once had. He also told her that forgiveness was not punishment removed from the past. It was simply refusing to let the past control the future. 2 years after the wedding, Daniel started a foundation dedicated to helping employees and small investors report financial abuse without fear. The foundation grew quickly. One of its first programs helped workers who had been intimidated by powerful employers. Daniel often told them the same thing. Your position does not determine your value, and silence does not make wrongdoing disappear. Then, one afternoon, he received an unexpected visitor. Emily stood outside his office. She looked different, older, calmer, and less afraid. Daniel invited her inside. They sat across from each other in the same kind of quiet room where their relationship had once been discussed in happier circumstances. Emily smiled faintly. "You look well." Daniel nodded. "So do you." She looked down at her hands. "I didn't come to ask for another chance." Daniel said nothing. "I came to thank you." He frowned. "For what?" "For ending the wedding." Daniel was surprised. Emily continued. "At the time, I thought you were punishing me. I thought you hated me. But you gave me something I couldn't give myself. You stopped the lie." Daniel listened. "If you had married me that night, I would have continued protecting my father. I would have continued hiding things. And eventually, you would have been destroyed with us." She looked into his eyes. "You didn't save yourself because you didn't love me. You saved yourself because you finally understood that loving someone doesn't mean following them into destruction." Daniel looked down. "I'm glad you're safe." Emily smiled through tears. "So am I." She stood. Before leaving, she placed something on his desk. It was the wedding photograph. The picture showed Daniel and Emily standing together before the ceremony, smiling at one another. "I thought you might want it." Daniel looked at the photograph. "Why give it to me?" "Because it was still part of my life. I don't want to pretend it never happened." Daniel nodded. "Neither do I." She walked toward the door. Daniel called her name. Emily turned. "I forgive you." Tears filled her eyes. "Thank you. But I'm not asking you to come back." She nodded. "I know." And then she left. Daniel remained alone in the office. He looked at the photograph for a long time. The strange thing about painful memories, he later said, was that they didn't always disappear. Sometimes they simply changed meaning. The wedding photograph no longer represented the beginning of a marriage. It represented the moment before Daniel learned the difference between love and trust, between forgiveness and reconciliation, between compassion and surrender. 3 years after the wedding, Daniel returned to the Rosewood Grand for a charity event. He walked through the same ballroom where 200 people had once watched his life collapse. This time, there was no wedding altar, no expensive decorations, no champagne ceremony. Instead, the room was filled with employees, small business owners, community leaders, and families who had benefited from his foundation. Daniel stood at the front of the room and looked across the audience. He told them about the night someone poured black paint over his white tuxedo. He didn't tell them every detail. He didn't need to. The people listening understood the lesson. That night, he said. "I thought someone had ruined my wedding. I later realized they had interrupted a life I would have regretted living." The audience became silent. Daniel continued, "People often think justice means making the person who hurt you suffer. Sometimes justice is simply refusing to let what they did determine who you become." He looked around the room. "I could have spent the rest of my life angry. I could have destroyed everyone involved. Instead, I decided to build something they could never take away from me." Years later, the wedding story was still told. People remembered the black paint. They remembered the 200 guests. They remembered the bride standing strangely still while the groom was humiliated. They remembered the 6 words that ended the ceremony. But Daniel remembered something else. He remembered the moment immediately afterward, when he walked away from the altar and realized that his life had not ended. It had simply changed direction. The black paint eventually disappeared from his tuxedo. The wedding photographs faded with time. The headlines became old news. The court records were archived. Victor Lawson's name became associated with one of the largest financial scandals in the region. Marcus rebuilt his life slowly after serving his sentence. Emily continued working with people who had been trapped by fear and manipulation. And Daniel continued building his foundation, helping others recognize the warning signs he had once ignored himself. He never remarried immediately. For years, people asked him why. His answer was always the same. "I wasn't afraid of love. I was afraid of forgetting what I learned." Eventually, he met someone new, but he didn't rush. He asked questions. He listened. He allowed trust to grow instead of demanding it instantly. And when that relationship eventually became serious, he told her the truth about the wedding. She didn't judge him. She simply said, "You survived something painful. You don't have to pretend it didn't change you." Daniel smiled. "It changed me." She asked, "For better or worse?" He thought about the black paint covering his white tuxedo. For better, because the man who walked into that ballroom believing love could survive anything was not the same man who walked out of it. The groom who had stood at the altar had believed that keeping a promise meant staying no matter what. The man who left understood that some promises should never be kept at the expense of your dignity, your safety, or your truth. And perhaps that is why the paint mattered. It wasn't simply paint. It was humiliation, betrayal, fear, manipulation, and deception poured into one unforgettable moment. Yet it also became the beginning of Daniel's freedom. He didn't cancel the wedding because his suit was ruined. He didn't cancel it because 200 guests had watched him suffer. He canceled it because, in that moment, he finally understood that the person standing beside him was not the person he thought he was marrying. The 6 words he spoke that night were simple. "I can't marry you. We're done." But sometimes the most powerful decisions in life don't require a speech. They require courage. Courage to walk away when everyone expects you to stay. Courage to admit that love isn't enough when honesty is missing. Courage to forgive without returning to the place that broke you. And courage to begin again when the future you planned has disappeared in front of you. Daniel once believed his wedding day had been destroyed. Years later, he understood something different. The wedding was destroyed. His future was not. Because sometimes, the moment that humiliates you in front of everyone becomes the moment that saves you from a life you would have regretted. Sometimes the person who tries to make you look small accidentally reveals how powerful you really are. And sometimes walking away from the altar is not the end of your story. It is the first page of a better one. So if there is one thing Daniel's story leaves behind, it is this. Pay attention to how people treat you when they believe you have nothing to offer them. Pay attention to the excuses that arrive before the truth. Pay attention to the people who ask you to stay silent because they claim it will protect the person you love. And most importantly, never confuse forgiveness with permission to hurt you again. Daniel lost a wedding that day, but he gained his freedom. And years later, when people asked him whether he would change anything about that night, he always gave the same answer. No, because the paint ruined his tuxedo. The betrayal ruined his plans. But walking away saved his life.